OPEPP's webinar series, Learning About Paras, from Michael Giangreco. I'm Amy Howley. I work as a consultant with the Ohio Partnership for Excellence in Paraprofessional Preparation at the University of Cincinnati's Systems Development and Improvement Center. In this first webinar in the series, we hear from Michael Giangreco. His comments focus on the main points presented in his article, Constructively Responding to Requests for Paraprofessionals. We keep asking the wrong questions. Here's a picture of Michael Giangreco. He's a professor in the Department of Education at the University of Vermont and is also affiliated with the Center on Disability and Community Inclusion. He has been on the faculty at the University of Vermont since 1988. Prior to that, he held a variety of jobs: special education teacher, community residence counselor with adults with developmental disabilities, and special education administrator. Dr. Giangreco's work on special education parapros fits with his long-standing interest in ways to plan, adapt, coordinate, implement, and evaluate educational programs and services for students with disabilities. In this webinar, Dr. Giangreco will talk about guiding principles for providing support to students with disabilities. He'll explain these principles in more detail, but for now, I'll just list them. First, all students with disabilities deserve access to, and their primary instruction from, highly qualified teachers and special educators. Second, students should receive only those support services that are both educationally relevant and necessary. Third, educators should provide special services that are only as special or only as specialized as necessary. Fourth, schools should use natural supports to the greatest extent possible. The fifth guiding principle says that educators should make sure that students with disabilities have a voice in determining supports used to help them learn. The sixth guiding principle is that paraprofessionals need to be adequately trained for their roles and their work needs to be supervised. And the final guiding principle says that the use of a one-to-one paraprofessional should always be treated as a temporary measure. So let's get started. Michael, can you tell us a little about the list of guiding principles?
So to start off with, I want to just say that the list that's in the article is a non-exhaustive list. It's a list of examples. But it's so important to have a set of guiding principles that are consistent with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and also promising practices in the field, so that we make sure that the support services that we're providing are actually educationally relevant.
What's the first guiding principle?
So one of the first items that was listed in that article was just a very basic principle, but one that surprisingly isn't always followed, and that's simply that all students with disabilities deserve access to and their primary instruction from highly qualified teachers and special educators. Too often, some of our students with the most intensive needs are getting a substantial amount of their instruction from paraprofessionals who are well-meaning and maybe doing a great job, but by definition, they're not teachers or special educators. So I want to make sure that all kids have access to high-quality instruction from licensed professionals.
Making sure all students receive their education from licensed professionals is the first guiding principle. What's the second guiding principle?
One of the things that's so important is that we want to make sure that support services are both educationally relevant and necessary. And there's an old cowboy saying, never ask a barber if he thinks you need a haircut. And because the answer is always going to be yes. And similarly, if you ask people in the helping professions if they can help, the answer is always going to be yes, but that's really the wrong question to be asking. The related services provision of the IDEA asks us to consider what's educationally necessary, meaning that without that service, the student won't be able to receive a free, appropriate public education. So these are two really different bars, and we want to narrow the scope from what could help to what is necessary, and is designed to help students and make sure that they get the supports that they need. So it's important to remember that students with disabilities don't go to school to get therapy. They go to school to get an education, and they receive related services if those support services are necessary for the students to access and participate in their education.
To summarize, then, we might rephrase the second guiding principle with the statement, students should receive only those support services that are both educationally relevant and necessary. What's the third guiding principle?
Another guiding principle that we've used in our own work is the idea of providing services that are, quote, only as special or only as specialized as necessary. And that this is kind of the least restrictive support option. The opposite, there's kind of two opposites of this. One is the more is better approach. The idea that, well, if one session of therapy or related service is good, two is better, and three would be even better yet. And the problem with that is that it's benevolent intention, but can be misguided in terms of if we're giving students support services that they don't need, that aren't necessary for them to access their education, sometimes this actually interferes with them getting an appropriate education. Another opposite is what some people have termed a return on investment model. And this is a very slippery slope of making decisions about students based on what we think that they will contribute based on what we're providing them in terms of support. So the alternative to both of those kind of unhelpful approaches is only as special as necessary. So we're trying to give kids what they need, but not more than they need. And I want to point out that only as special as necessary doesn't necessarily mean a little bit. For some students, only as special as necessary could be quite extensive supports, and in other cases, it's less so.
So the third guiding principle is to provide supports that are only as special as necessary. In other words, we should first rely on supports that are available to all students before we intensify our level of support by using special arrangements that meet the needs only of an individual student or small subset of students. Could you share the fourth guiding principle? From my reading of your article, it seems like the fourth principle is an extension or offshoot of the third.
Another guiding principle that is mentioned in the article is the idea of teams providing natural supports. So one of the things that we've kind of gotten into the habit of in special education, maybe not surprisingly, is making everything special. And sometimes special things can be stigmatizing, or they can get in the way of more natural support. So when I say natural supports, I'm talking about the kinds of supports that would be available to students if they didn't have a disability, like the regular classroom teacher, like their peers. Could be some very commonly available assistive technology, like using an iPad, something like that. And it's not that we don't sometimes need specialized supports, because obviously sometimes we do, but that we shouldn't start immediately with the most specialized or highly specialized supports, that we should start with more natural supports first. And this is true also when we're thinking about the personnel supports, like, for example, assigning a one-to-one paraprofessional as the first option is probably overly specialized and potentially overly restrictive before considering if there are ways to support that student in other ways.
So finding ways to provide natural supports is the fourth principle. What's the fifth guiding principle?
Which really leads right into one of the next points in terms of guiding principles, which is making sure that students with disabilities have a voice in determining their own supports. So basically self-determination. Lots of times we can ask students directly what they need, what's helpful, what's not helpful, what feels good to them in terms of support, what feels intrusive in terms of support. And this is something that we can start in an age-appropriate way when kids are really young and keep increasing as they age.
So the fifth principle is self-determination. We can ask students what they need. And when we provide a support, we can ask them whether or not it's working for them. Are there more guiding principles? Could you explain the next one?
Just a couple more of these before we go on to the next question. But in some situations where paraprofessionals are utilized, they need to be adequately trained for their roles and supervised. And one of the things that happens is that we want to determine the roles of paraprofessionals, and this is a very common thing that schools do. It's like they want to do a job description, consider the roles of the paraprofessionals. And one of the things we've learned over time is that you really are not in a position to determine the appropriate role for paraprofessionals until you have appropriately determined the role for the teachers and the special educators. Once you've done that, then you're in a position to start asking questions about how we can utilize paraprofessionals in ways that support the work of the teacher and the special educator, as opposed to the paraprofessionals potentially supplanting the work of those folks. And this also leads to trying to avoid unhelpful double standards, whereby students with disabilities receive supports in ways that would be unacceptable for other students. So paraprofessionals are a great example of this. For example, we have data that suggests that there are some students, particularly students who receive one-to-one paraprofessional supports, who might be receiving 75, 80, in some cases 100% of their instruction from paraprofessionals. And there's a very general question that we encourage people to ask that can be applied to this issue and many other issues. And it's very simply this: would it be okay if the student didn't have a disability? Would the practice be okay? So, for example, if somebody said, we've got a new reading program that we're going to roll out for our first graders, and it's not going to be carried out by any of the teachers or literacy specialists. It's going to all be done by paraprofessionals who don't have necessarily training in how to do the program, and they're not really supervised as much as we really should, but that's what we're going to do. Or, some student needs help in math, and we're going to assign a person who maybe is not really comfortable with teaching math and doesn't have any background in teaching math. Is that what we would do for students who didn't have a disability? So this question of would it be okay if the student didn't have a disability is a really important one to consider.
Principle number 6 says that schools and districts should train paraprofessionals for their work and supervise them. What's the last guiding principle?
If a one-to-one paraprofessional is assigned, a guiding principle is at least to start by thinking of it as a temporary measure and to start to put plans in place to evaluate the impact of the service, and if at all possible, to fade that support as much and as soon as possible to encourage student independence and natural supports and appropriate interdependence.
So the final guiding principle talks about treating the assignment of one-to-one paraprofessionals as a temporary measure. How can these guiding principles help teams of educators?
Those are some of the examples of the kinds of guiding principles that a team might consider. and try to get everybody on the same wavelength on the team so that when someone suggests something, you can then judge it against your own guiding principles that you've agreed to as a school or a team.
I hear you saying that these 7 guiding principles can provide standards that teams of educators can use to assess the likely benefits of their decisions about providing supports to students with disabilities. Let's review them one more time. As a quick review, here are the 7 guiding principles once again. 1. All students with disabilities deserve highly qualified teachers and special educators. 2. Students should receive only those support services that are both educationally relevant and necessary. 3. Educators should provide special services that are only as special as necessary. 4. Educators should use natural supports to the greatest extent possible. 5. Self-determination. Educators should make sure that students with disabilities have a voice in determining supports used to help them learn. 6. Paraprofessionals need to be adequately trained for their roles, and their work needs to be supervised. 7. The use of a one-to-one paraprofessional should always be treated as a temporary measure. Thank you for joining Michael Giangreco and me for this discussion of principles guiding the effective use of support, including the support of parapros, with students with disabilities. We hope you'll join us for other webinars in the series.